From the moment David entered my life, I felt a connection. The coffee shop we met in was bustling, but to me, everything faded into the background when I saw him. Our conversation flowed naturally. It felt like we had known each other for years. Soon, days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. I introduced him to Noah, my son from my previous marriage, hoping with all my heart that they would get along. David knelt down, ruffled Noah's hair, and said, "Hey champ, your mom's told me a lot about you." Noah, shy at first, quickly warmed up to him, sharing about his school, friends, and the latest video game he was into. David and I shared dreams of the future, quiet dinners, and Sunday morning brunches. We laughed at each other's silly jokes and comforted one another during tough times. The joy I felt with him was unparalleled. One evening, as we walked along the city pier, he stopped, taking my hands into his. The city lights danced in his eyes as he looked deep into mine. "Abigail," he began, his voice shaking slightly, "I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." He knelt and presented a beautiful ring. "Will you marry me?" Tears welled up in my eyes as I nodded. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times, yes." The wedding preparations were a whirlwind. Picking out the venue, the dress, the guest list. It was overwhelming but exciting. But a cloud seemed to loom in the horizon. David's mother, Mrs. Henderson. During our first meeting, I tried my best to make a good impression. However, she looked me up and down, her eyes critical. "So, Abigail, David tells me you've been married before," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. I nodded, "Yes, and I have a wonderful son, Noah." She sighed. "Well, we can't change the past, can we?" As the wedding approached, David seemed more and more distant. Whenever I brought up his mother's behavior, he'd brush it off. "She's just protective, Abby," he would reassure me. But on our wedding day, her true colors showed. As I walked down the aisle, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves, I overheard her whispering to a relative, "She looks nice, but I've seen better wedding gowns." Despite her snide remarks and passive, aggressive behavior, I held on to the hope that after the wedding, things would change. Maybe, just maybe, she would come to accept me. As the night drew to an end, David took my hand, pulling me into a dance. "We did it," he whispered, his eyes searching mine. "Everything will be okay from here." I wanted to believe him. I really did. The first days after the honeymoon were filled with euphoria. David and I were on cloud 9, reminiscing about our romantic getaway and making plans for our future. My home, filled with memories of Noah's childhood, became our nest. We began personalizing it, bringing in a blend of our tastes. David brought in a vintage record player he was fond of, and we'd dance in the living room to old tunes, laughing and singing along. However, it didn't take long for the clouds to roll in. Mrs. Henderson started visiting more frequently than I had anticipated. Her visits weren't the pleasant kind where you'd serve tea and chat about mundane things. No, they were filled with criticisms and thinly veiled insults. One day, as I was arranging the living room, she walked in, unannounced. "Abigail, dear," she started, glancing around with a frown. "This place could really use some fresh flowers, don't you think? It feels so drab." David, always trying to mediate, jumped in with a forced smile. "Mom, Abby and I like it this way. It has a cozy feel." Mrs. Henderson simply pursed her lips. Well, to each their own. Noah, my ray of sunshine, tried his best to stay out of Mrs. Henderson's way. But kids being kids, he once excitedly showed her a painting he did at school. With a hint of pride, he presented it to her, saying, "Look, Grandma, I made this." Her response was cold and dismissive. Not bad, but perhaps next time, try staying inside the lines." It broke my heart to see the light dim in Noah's eyes. I pulled him close, whispering words of encouragement. "Your painting is beautiful, love. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Evenings were the hardest. After dinner, she'd often stay, making herself comfortable on our couch, passing comments on the show we were watching, or criticizing the meal I had prepared. "The roast was a bit dry today," she'd remark, or "I've told David how I make it, but I suppose he hasn't shared that with you." David seemed torn. He'd often come to bed stressed, muttering about wanting peace and trying to balance between his loyalty to his mother and his commitment to me. "Abby, she's old. She's set in her ways," he'd sigh. "Please try to understand." I tried, for David's sake and for the sake of our marriage. but the strain was evident. The house that was once filled with laughter and love now had an underlying tension. Every knock on the door made my heart race, wondering if it was another unexpected visit from Mrs. Henderson. Through it all, I held on to hope. Perhaps with time, she'd come to see the love and effort I put into our home and our family. Perhaps one day, she'd come to accept and even love us for who we were. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, that hope started to fade. October began with its characteristic chill, the trees donning their hues of red and gold. The neighborhood buzzed with anticipation for Halloween. Kids spoke animatedly about costumes, candy, and haunted houses. In our home, the excitement was no less palpable. Noah had already begun brainstorming his costume ideas, switching between wanting to be a superhero one day and a spooky ghost the next. One evening, David and I sat in our kitchen going through the mail. Among the bills and advertisements, there was an envelope with familiar handwriting. I opened it and found an invitation from our friends, Mark and Lisa, inviting us to their annual Halloween bash. "This could be fun," David said, looking over our shoulder. "We haven't been out together in a while." "But what about Noah?" I asked, concern evident in my voice. We rarely left him alone, especially on a night like Halloween. David pondered for a moment, then, with a hint of hesitation, said, "Why not let him stay with my mother for the night? She's family, Abby, and Noah's older now. He'll be okay." The idea made me uneasy. The memories of Mrs. Henderson's disdainful words and dismissive attitude towards Noah resurfaced. "David, I'm not sure." I began, trying to choose my words carefully. "She hasn't been the kindest to him." David took my hands, looking earnestly into my eyes. "She's still his grandmother. Maybe this is a chance for them to bond, for her to see the wonderful boy he is." He was hopeful, perhaps even a bit desperate, wanting to bridge the growing chasm between his wife and mother. With a deep sigh, I finally relented. "Okay, but only if Noah is comfortable with it." The days leading up to Halloween were filled with preparations. Noah finally settled on a ghost costume, which we had fun making together. He seemed to grow excited about the idea of spending time with his grandmother, his youthful optimisms making me second guess my own reservations. A day before Halloween, Mrs. Henderson came over, and to my surprise, she seemed more amicable. "So, Noah, I hear you're spending Halloween with me," she said, a semblance of warmth in her voice. Noah nodded eagerly. "Yes, Grandma, Mom and I made my ghost costume. Do you want to see?" She smiled, a genuine one. "Or so I hoped." "Of course, dear. I'm sure it's fantastic." As she left, she pulled David aside. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I saw David nodding, his face a mix of relief and gratitude. When he returned to the kitchen, he seemed lighter, more upbeat. "She promised she'll take good care of him," he said, wrapping his arms around me. I wanted to believe that everything would be all right, that this Halloween would be a turning point for all of us. But deep down, an unsettling feeling lingered, like the calm before a storm. Halloween evening dawned with a misty gray overcast, casting a moody atmosphere throughout the neighborhood. Children's laughter and the sounds of trick or treating filled the air. At our home, the anticipation for the night's events was palpable. As the sun began to set, Noah, dressed in his ghost costume, flitted around the house. The white sheet billowed as he moved, and he had cleverly crafted chains from paper, which he rattled for effect. "Look, Mom," he exclaimed, trying to spook me. "I'm the ghost of the house." Laughing, I pulled him into a hug. "You sure are scary," I teased, planting a kiss on his forehead. David, meanwhile, was preparing for our night out. He looked dapper in his suit, adjusting his tie in the mirror. Catching my reflection, he winked. "Ready for a fun night, Mrs. Ghost?" Just then, the doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Henderson arriving punctually. She entered, looking around, her gaze lingering on Noah. "So, young man, ready to spend some quality time with your grandmother?" Noah hesitated momentarily, then nodded. "Yeah, Grandma, we can watch a movie or something." Mrs. Henderson's lips curved into what seemed like a genuine smile. "That sounds wonderful." I pulled David aside, whispering, "Are you sure about this?" "I'm getting a weird vibe." David placed his hand on my shoulder, trying to soothe my concerns. "It'll be okay, Abby. It's just one night. What could go wrong?" Oh, how I wished he was right. The party was in full swing by the time we arrived at Mark and Lisa's place. Music blared from the speakers, and the house was filled with people dressed in an array of costumes. Friends greeted us warmly, and for a moment I let myself relax, enjoying the festivities. However, as the hours ticked by, a nagging feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leaped, half expecting a call from Noah. But each time, it was just another message or notification. As midnight approached, David and I decided to head home. The drive back felt longer than usual, my thoughts consumed with how Noah's evening with Mrs. Henderson went. The sight that met us upon reaching our doorstep is one that still haunts me. The door was slightly ajar, the lights inside dimmed. Panic surged as we hurried in, calling out, "Mrs. Henderson?" No response. Frantically, I dialed Noah's number. Voicemail. The chilling silence of the house weighed heavily, pressing down on my chest. Just as I was about to call the police, my phone rang. It was Mrs. Henderson. "Oh, Abigail, I thought Noah would be home by now. He wanted some fresh air, so I let him go for a walk." My heart dropped. "What do you mean a walk? It's freezing out." The condescension in her voice was evident. "He's a big boy. He'll be fine." Suddenly, a soft knock interrupted our conversation. Racing to the door, we found Noah, his ghost costume now dirty and tattered, his eyes red from crying. His fingers were blue, the paper chains now soggy and limp. Pulling him into my arms, his voice, weak and trembling, broke through. "She said I was too noisy. Mom, she didn't want me there anymore." The storm I had sensed was no longer approaching. It had arrived. The moment we stepped inside our home, the atmosphere felt different, heavy, charged with anger, worry, and regret. The living room, usually our sanctuary, felt cold and unforgiving. I immediately wrapped Noah in a warm blanket and made him hot cocoa. As I looked into his pale face, memories of his first steps, his first words, all the moments we had shared in this very room, came flooding back. I felt a burning rage, thinking of how someone could be so heartless as to harm this innocent soul. Noah, shivering, clutched the mug with both hands. I kept ringing the bell. "Mom," he whispered, his voice quivering, but she didn't open the door. She just shouted from inside that I was too noisy and ruining her evening. David, having been silent till now, knelt beside Noah, his face a mixture of guilt and anger. "Buddy, I'm so sorry. I never thought. I didn't know she'd do something like this." A biting silence filled the room. Taking a deep breath, I dialed Mrs. Henderson's number. The phone rang a few times before she picked up, her voice dripping with fox sweetness. "Abigail, is everything all right?" I struggled to keep my voice steady. "You left my son outside, in the cold. How could you?" Her scoff sent shivers down my spine. "Oh, please, Abigail. He's Abigail. A bit of cold never hurt anyone. You're just overreacting as always." David, overhearing the conversation, grabbed the phone. "Mom, what you did is inexcusable. Noah could have gotten seriously hurt." All she offered was a nonchalant, "I did what I thought was best." The realization hit hard and fast. Mrs. Henderson was never going to change. She would always be this vindictive, harmful presence in our lives. The next morning, Noah woke up with a terrible fever. We rushed him to the hospital. As he lay in that hospital bed, hooked up to machines, his usual vibrant spirit dimmed, I made a promise to myself. I would never let anyone hurt my child again. The court case was nerve-wracking. Lawyers, hearings, testimonies. It felt like a whirlwind, but the evidence was clear. Neighbors testified about seeing Noah outside, cold and crying. Mrs. Henderson's cruel actions were laid bare for all to see. In the courtroom, as the judge announced that Mrs. Henderson was ordered to pay $200,000 for her actions, I felt a sense of vindication. Money couldn't heal the trauma Noah went through, but it was a start. As for David, the cracks in our marriage that had been forming over the past months had now become gaping chasms. The incident with Noah was the last straw. It wasn't just about his mother's cruelty, but his own inaction and misplaced loyalties. Our home, which once echoed with laughter and love, now felt like a battlefield. It was time to move on, to build a safer, happier life for Noah and me, away from the shadows of the past. The days following the verdict were a blur. The legal victory, though significant, felt hollow in the face of the emotional trauma Noah and I had experienced. The media had caught wind of the case, painting lurid headlines about the monster grandmother. Every morning, our doorstep was cluttered with reporters and their cameras, vying for a statement, a glimpse into our lives. Inside our home, the atmosphere was tense. David, a shadow of his former jovial self, shuffled around lost. He had tried apologizing, pleading, explaining, but words felt woefully inadequate. One evening, as I sat in Noah's room, watching him doodle in his sketchbook, David entered holding out a piece of paper. "It's the divorce papers," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked up, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. "David, this isn't just about your mother anymore. It's about us, our inability to protect our family." He nodded, tears forming in his eyes. "I know, Abby, and I can't forgive myself for letting things get this far." We sat in silence, the finality of the situation settling in. Our love story, which had started with so much promise, was now a collection of regrets and what ifs. Noah, sensing the tension, came over and took my hand. "Mom, whatever happens, we'll be okay, right?" His innocence and strength in the face of adversity were a constant source of inspiration. "Yes, sweetie," I whispered, hugging him close. "We'll be just fine." The process of divorce was painful but necessary. The house, which had been a witness to our highs and lows, needed a fresh start. I decided to sell it, using the money from the sale and the compensation from the court case to buy a new place for Noah and me. As the moving trucks loaded our belongings, David stood at a distance watching. Our eyes met, a whirlwind of emotions passing between us. "Take care, Abby," he called out, his voice filled with genuine concern. "You too, David," I replied, a hint of sadness in my voice. Life in our new home was different but comforting. The echoes of our past still lingered, but there was also hope, the promise of new beginnings. Noah thrived, making new friends and excelling in school. And as for me, the wounds began to heal, slowly but surely. Revenge wasn't what drove me. It was the need for justice, for a safe space for my son and me. And in the end, justice, though cold and hard, fought